Okay, folks, here we are to start our little trip through moral philosophy in the Western tradition of philosophy, which basically that's kind of an over exaggeration as well. It's really ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, um, some medieval European and con contemporary modern European thinkers as well, and some contemporary Anglophone thinkers. So a fairly limited view, but obviously plenty for us to spend a semester on, but certainly not something that exhausts all there is to learn about ethics. So there's lots of stuff we're not covering that's also worthwhile to learn about, and it would present some different perspectives even than what we're able to cover in just a single semester. So I encourage you to look that stuff up as well. So here we are in ancient ethics in ancient Greek and Roman thought. We're going to start off with we're going to cover a few basic big thinkers in this chapter: Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and Epicurus. Out of that group, the most influential on contemporary thought is probably Aristotle, at least in academic philosophy, although you can find lots of popular writings about the Stoics for sure. The Stoics are real big in Silicon Valley and among executives for some reason. So you can find lots of stuff on the internet about the Stoics. Not all of it's very good, but people paying attention to those thinkers anyway. So we're going to start off with Plato today. Remember that from our earlier lectures, we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester, since we're going chronologically rather than thematically through moral theory. Some of this might get jumbled up on you, but you need to keep separate some basic different questions. And so over the course of the semester, we'll be looking at two basic meta-ethical questions, although not always with every thinker will we cover both of these. And then every thinker we'll look at will cover some normative or normative related stuff. And so two big meta-ethical questions to worry about are always the question or problem of moral motivation. That's, can just be stated as the question, why be moral? Another way of thinking about it is it rational to be moral? And then of course we have to figure out what it means to be rational. In a lot of ways, what moral reasoning is what thinkers are disagreeing about. They're not really disagreeing over the content of morality so much, whether a particular kind of action is right or wrong, although they do have those disagreements. And we'll study many of those because they help illuminate differences in moral reasoning. But what they're really disagreeing about for the most part is the justification of morality, or why things are moral or immoral. So lots and lots of people think you ought to generally keep your promises. They start to disagree about exceptions, what the exceptions are to that, and then what justifies those exceptions, that kind of thing. And then the problem of objectivity in morality, and what we're worried about there is whether there are any objective moral truths. And what I mean by a moral truth is not a descriptive claim there, but a prescriptive claim, a normative claim, right? And so although some academic philosophers have thought that metaethics and normative ethics are two autonomous or distinct fields, I don't really buy that myself. And I don't want to make a big generalization about the field of moral philosophy, but I don't think that's as prevalent now as it used to be. So for an example of someone that thought that way, you can look at J.L. Mackey's The Invention of Morality. There's a book from a few decades ago by an influential thinker. Error theory that he came up with is still influential in various ways. But he advocated for a subjectivist view of morality, and then went along to propose a kind of normative account of ethics, right? Because he thought that they were too distinct, so there was no contradiction involved there. And of course, he had arguments for that stuff. For a thinker that takes the opposite view, you might look at Shelley Kagan. He has a book on an introduction to normative ethics, and in the introduction to that book, he points out, and I think this is basically, I kind of have the similarity with him, that when we talk about metaethics, we end up asking about, well, what are the prescriptive truths, right? And so there's the relationship. And that's how I tend to think about it, and how I tend to teach moral theory is that when we answer the question, how should I live or what ought I do? and someone says, well, you ought keep your promises, or you ought keep your promises except when doing so will bring about more harm in the world than it will good. We can ask, what is the status of that claim? And there's the meta-ethical question about the status of a prescriptive truth, or a prescriptive claim, or a normative claim. And so that's how I think about the relationship there, is that I think that meta-ethics is about the status or the foundations or the ultimate nature of a normative or prescriptive claim, either a moral principle that guides moral judgments or particular moral judgments themselves. And so two big normative questions: how should I live, and what ought I do? I've talked about the difference in how which of those questions you start out with will shape the kind of theory that you have. How should I live is much more broad. How should I live my whole life? What kind of person should I be? Versus a question that's what ought I do, that tends to be focused on particular acts. And so we've talked about the difference between act-based theories and character-based theories. And what we'll be looking at in ancient ethics is character-based theories. So a bit of a different theoretical emphasis there. So they're beginning from the question, what kind of person should I be, or how should I live? And that was Socrates' question, and that's where we'll start off here. So again, think about, as we go through the chapters, think about how each of these thinkers is addressing these sorts of different questions about morality, meta-ethical questions versus normative questions, and try to keep those straight, although they are related to one another. And so with that in mind, let's take a look at Plato's moral theory. And for our purposes, I'm just going to talk about Plato and Socrates together here. If you were in an ancient Greek philosophy class or a Plato class, you might start to delve into the issue of whether Plato presents Socrates always in a positive light and therefore is critiquing what Socrates is saying in the dialogues or not. We won't get into that issue here. I'm just going to talk about them the same, but I want majors and minors to know that would be in philosophy majors and minors to know, or people that are interested in classical thought, that would be an issue you would have to address. But for our purposes, I'm just going to talk about Plato and Socrates as being the same view. I'm not really talking about the people. I'm talking about the view that we find in Plato's books here. So Plato's moral theory. I need to fix that there. Why don't I just do it right now? So Plato and moral theory, right? So that's what we'll be looking at first here. Let me get it back up. If my computer wants to cooperate with me there. So Plato and moral theory. Why be moral, right? And Plato or Socrates is going to have an objectivist account of that, a rational account. And so we can start off by thinking about why be moral in a slightly different way, right? So in Rick and Morty, I've mentioned I'm going to use Rick and Morty as an example here a lot, and this is a good place to start doing that. If you've seen the show, you know that Rick has a portal gun in the show. There's a multiverse, or the reality is a multiverse. So it's possible with this technology of a portal gun to travel into different universes. And of course, we know that this has influenced Rick's view of values, morality, as well as the meaning of life. And the portal gun allows Rick to escape what he's done in any particular universe, right? And escape to a different universe, a different parallel universe. And so this raises a kind of question. And you see this in the show. Rick thinks that the universe is so big and so varied and you can move throughout it that he doesn't seem to have a lot of psychological attachments to particular individuals. This seems to lead him to the view that life is meaningless, that all there is his own ego. And so we don't see Rick acting in a lot of moral ways. In fact, in one episode, Vindicators, the Vindicators episode, we see Morty say for Rick that good and bad are artificial constructions, right? And so this raises a question. If you had a portal gun, why bother being moral, right? It seems like the only reason lots and lots of people act morally is because they're afraid of punishment. But if you had the portal gun, you could escape punishment. And that's what we see, in fact, Rick doing a lot with the portal gun, is escaping the consequences of his action where people are coming after him, allows him to get away. And we know through the series that Rick left his own family, right, and went off for an extended period of time and then supposedly comes back into their lives because he was out traipsing around the multiverse. So Rick typically disregards concern for others, which is we tend to think of that as a big part of morality. Some people would say that's what morality really is what I owe other people, rather than what I do to myself. It's about how I have to treat others. Rick typically disregards that. So Socrates' question, what should I do? And then the other Socratic question, why be moral? The question of moral motivation, or the question at the heart of the problem of moral motivation, why be moral at all if you have a portal gun? And so that's kind of a contemporary version of something we find in Plato's Republic called the Ring of Gyges. The big question in Plato's Republic is, what is justice? You can think of it again in a slightly different way. What is fairness? Right? That's the central question in that dialogue, the Republic. Socrates proposes an answer in response to others in that dialogue. It tries to answer that question. And again, it sounds like, well, what is justice? The way to answer that's not to look up in the dictionary what justice is. In fact, if you did that, if you looked up what is justice, you'd see it talking about fairness. And if you saw the definition of fairness, you'd see it talking about justice. Well, it's kind of a tautology there. It doesn't really help us flush that out. So again, what we're looking for is something more than just a dictionary definition as a way of answering that question. And so in this dialogue, the Republic, what Socrates and his various interlocutors, his conversation partners do is they attempt to examine the nature of the just individual, the just society, and in the course of doing so, they take up this question, why be moral? The whole dialogue is about, it's a central question. What is justice is a central question for moral and political philosophy. And the big task of the Republic is to try and think about what an ideally just society would look like. What would that be? What would justice be in the ideal society, right? And so as a way of addressing that why be moral question as a part of that larger investigation about justice, they use the myth of Gyges, or the Ring of Gyges myth. And here's how the myth goes. Suppose now that there were two such magic rings. So we got two rings, and it's an invisibility ring, right? So suppose now that there are two such magic rings, and the fair person, the just person, put on one of them, and the unjust the other. No man can be imagined to be of such iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. No man would keep his hands off of what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects would be like a god among men. Then the actions of the just would be the actions of the unjust. Those two people would start to act alike if you had a ring on, the invisibility ring. They would both come at last to the same point. And this we may truly affirm to be a great proof that man is just, not willingly, or because he thinks justice is any good to him individually, but out of necessity. For whenever anyone thinks that he can safely be unjust, there he is unjust. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice. And he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. If you could imagine anyone obtaining this power of becoming invisible and never doing any wrong or touching what was another's, he would be thought by the onlookers to be the most wretched idiot, although they would praise him to one another's faces and keep up appearances with one another from fear that they too might suffer injustice. So the idea here is, well, first notice that it sets up justice or morality versus my own self-interest so self-interest is one thing, and then fairness or justice is something else, right? So we have this apparent conflict between what's in my interest, what my wants and desires are. Think of it in Rick's way as my own ego, right? My own egoistic desires and wants and needs versus what morality requires of me. And we see Rick doing that, right? He doesn't have any regard for justice because the universe is so big and he can get away from any kind of power. Rick doesn't have an invisibility ring. Instead, he's got a portal gun. But largely saves the same function, right? And so Glaucon, one of the interlocutors in the dialogue, sets this up and then challenges Socrates to prove that the just person, if they had the invisibility ring, would continue to be just. would continually to be a moral person or a just person. Whereas his other interlocutors think that, look, if you don't fear punishment in any way, you've got no reason, notice how I'm putting it there, no justification for being moral. So that's the immoralist challenge out of Plato's Republic, right? And again, as I just mentioned, the immoralist challenge is set up to presume that self-interest or egoism is opposed to morality, right? So that's something to keep in mind here. And then we have some questions here. Is it rational to be moral if you have a portal gun or the invisibility ring? Just pause for a moment and go back and reread this myth of Gyges legend here and ask yourself, is there a good reason to be moral even if there's no threat of punishment for immorality? Is it rational to be moral even if you don't have to fear punishment? Rick's answer seems to be no. The interlocutors in the Plato's Republic answer also seems to be, well, is no, but Socrates has a different answer there, right? And so Socrates takes up the challenge of trying to show that even if you had no prudential reason to be moral out of fear of punishment and getting caught, that you would still have a reason to be moral. And he's going to, try and take aim at this idea that self-interest and morality are opposed to one another as well. And so what he does, Glaucon is, again, one of the interlocutors, is he identifies three types of goods, three things that are good, and challenges Socrates to show that, what category does justice fit in here? Does morality fit into here? So first, there are things that are good that we desire only for their consequences, such as physical training. I'm trying to change my diet for the consequences, namely good health, right? Things that we desire for their own sake, independent of the consequences of them. And the example that's given there is joy, right? So in other words, that's something that is desired is an intrinsic good, not as an instrumental good, right? So things that are intrinsically good are good in and of themselves and not merely as means to something else, right? So I desire physical training as a means to good health, instrumental good. But then there are other things that we seemingly desire for their own sake rather than just their consequences, right? Joy is the example there. You can think of happiness there, right? And then the third class of things are things that we desire both for their own sake and for what we get from them. So in other words, both because they're instrumentally valuable and because they're intrinsically valuable. So like sight and health. I don't desire health for anything other than for its own sake, but also because it's going to let me live longer, right? So, and that's supposedly the highest class of goods. Right? Things that we desire both for their own sake or intrinsically and for what we get from them. And then Glaucon suggests that people are only moral because they do not want to be punished, not because it is in their self-interest to do so or to be moral, or because it's rational to be moral, even if one does not fear punishment. So in other words, he's saying that people are only moral. We only value morality for its consequences. Escaping punishment, not getting caught, lowest form of good in this hierarchy of goods here. So again, Glaucon suggests that the majority of people are only good or moral because they don't want to be punished for the bad things they do. In short, he's contending that justice is not valued for its own sake or intrinsically, but only for its consequences. And then he sets up Socrates to try to challenge to try to persuade them that justice or morality is an intrinsic good, right? And in order to do that, he sets out first in the rest of the dialogue by trying to identify the just individual and the just city. So the individual is like a microcosm of the just city. So you got this self versus self related to society view going on there. And Thrasymachus, another one of the interlocutors, he says, listen, I say justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. So in our Rick and Morty world, justice is just whatever Rick says, right? Because he can get away with whatever and he can manipulate everybody and he can impose his will on everyone, right? Socrates is going to have a different view of justice than just whatever the strong people say. So Thrasymachus is a might makes right view. All right, and so in the dialogue, what Socrates does is he says, look, the just individual has a well-ordered soul. And so that's a way of thinking about what justice is. It's about a well-ordered soul and a well-ordered society. So he says, look, human nature has three basic parts to it. They use the word soul there. I kind of shy away from that because, you know, it tends to have lots and lots of other religious connotations that you have to clear through. But so let's think about it in terms of, you know, ultimate human nature, metaphysical human nature, the soul. He thought that it had three parts, right? Eros and appetites or desires, thumos, spiritedness or courage, and then rationality. So these are the three main aspects of the individual or of human nature, and justice is the proper ordering or proper balance of those. The slogan that gets used here for Socrates or Plato's notion of justice is one man, one individual, one person, one job, everybody playing their role. And so what we want in the just individual is each of the parts of human nature or each parts of the soul playing their role, governed by reason. Right? So what's most distinctive about human beings, and lots of philosophers have certainly held this view, is not our desires or our emotions, but our ability to reason. That's what makes human beings what they are, is the capacity for reason, as opposed to my cat over here who, you know, seemingly runs from one end of the house to the other without any reason whatsoever. It looks like just instinct. It's not like there's any kind of reflection going on. It doesn't seem to be any thinking about the way the cat thinks internally going on amongst himself there. And the just society then is one in which each person, depending on their predominant nature, plays their role. And so craftsmen, eros, or the appetites are predominant. They primarily are in the business of the trades, right, or producing crafts, goods, and services for exchange to fulfill our desires. And then the guardians, the warriors, right, what's most predominant in them? Courage or spiritedness, thumos, and then rationality or the philosopher kings. So in a just society, as a society in which each segment of society, craftsmen, guardians, and philosopher kings, play their role governed by reason. So notice intellect, rationality is in charge, according to Plato, in a just society. And so in the just individual, right, is a well-ordered soul in which reason plays, in which reason governs the other things. Reason reins in and controls my appetites and my spiritedness so I don't eat all the Reese's peanut butter cups and destroy my health, or I don't run into battle foolhardily and without a plan and kill myself, right, or get killed. So rationality is in charge. We're going to see that in every theory, almost every theory that we look at. It's going to be morality is going to be based on reason. It's just that these folks are disagreeing about what moral reasoning the exact precise nature of what moral reasoning is. And so in one way of thinking about the course, what we're doing is, you know, we're looking at different moral theories, but in many ways, and this will become more clear as we go, we're worried about learning different types of moral reasoning. And of course, each of these, almost all of the philosophers that we're going to cover thought that, you know, they thought they were discovering, not inventing moral reasoning, right? Only a few of the ones we'll cover, those are the outliers, think that, you know, morality is an invention. And so what we need to do, according to many ancient thinkers, and of course, Plato is among, Socrates and Plato are among here, are cultivate these virtues, right? In order to be happy, in order to have a just, balanced soul. So we need to have prudence or wisdom, the ability to know how to arrange means to ends in order to successfully meet those ends, right? And to reflect upon which ways are the best. We need temperance or moderation. We need courage, and we need to be fair, not only to ourselves, but to others, right? Now, this is a kind of key thing here. And this is where we come back to this notion of morality and its connection to happiness. The ancient Greek word for this was eudaimonia. You got to make sure that you keep different views of eudaimonia straight as we're looking at Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and Epicurus, they're all going to talk about happiness or eudaimonia, but they're going to have different ways of thinking about that, what that actually means. And so Socrates, and we can see again Rick and Morty here. Rick is generally unhappy, as we all know. This is one of the things that drives him to drink and pursue his kind of base pleasures, as an escape when he's depressed. So the things he values are pretty much his scientific research, and then getting messed up, getting twisted on booze or other intoxicants or other pleasures. And so what Socrates does, and this is his answer to the ring of Gyges, is he says, look, the just person will be, if they had the ring on, or if we had a portal gun, will still be moral, because if they don't, they will be unhappy. So Socrates, Plato, emphasizes this notion that there is a high psychological cost to immorality, that immoral people are really unhappy people. They're unsuccessful at being persons. And so we could ask ourselves, do you think that Plato or Socrates overemphasized the psychological costs of immorality? Do people, generally speaking, have psychological difficulties due to immorality? Does their conscience get to them and make them unhappy? Here's just a little chart about what many young adults in the U.S. See in regard to this. They tend to see others as selfish, exploited, and untrustworthy. They tend to see other people, and maybe make an exception of themselves here. We tend to do this as human beings. They tend to see others as being untrustworthy, selfish, and exploitive. And here's a little data point for that. If you're interested in that issue, you can look at I think it's called the Disconnected. It's a book about young adult and teenager views about things like how to treat people in video games, especially new players in video games and on social media and this sort of stuff. This little chart came from the Pew Research Center here. And as you can see, it says here, percentage of U.S. adults in each age groups who say most of the time people just look out for themselves, and 48% of people 65 or plus said that was the case, so less than half. 58% of people aged 50 to 64 thought that. Between folks that are 38 and 49 years old, so that'd be my age group, 67, so still a majority, but then 18 to 29-year-olds was the highest group who thought people most of the time just look out for themselves, and that was 73%. Here's the second point. Most people would try to take advantage of you if they got a chance. Again, age 65 and up, said 39% agreed with that statement. 50 to 64 age group, 56% agreed with that statement. In the 30 to 49 group, 62%. And then 18 to 29 age group, again, 71%. So the older you get, the less likely you are to think that people are selfish, exploited, and untrustworthy. We could ask ourselves, well, what's the basis for that claim? Is it because of the people, how people are acting in our age group that we're around, right? And then the last data point here, most people can't be trusted. 65 plus, only 29% thought that. 50 to 64 age group, 43% agreed with that statement. 30 to 49, 52% people agreed with that statement. And then 18 to 29 group 60% of that group affirmed that statement. So the younger you are, the more likely you are, at least currently, to think that others are selfish, exploited, and untrustworthy. So your book, they use these different examples of excess and desire and reining that stuff in. Obviously, temperance is, reining in your desires. Courage is not running foolhardily into battle. It's knowing when and how to fight, and when to stand up to injustice, right? And we could ask ourselves about Plato's moral theory in regard to Rick here. What would Plato or Socrates say about Rick's character? Would they think that he has wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice? Does he have a well-balanced soul? Does he have a soul in which Eros and spiritedness are governed by reason. And then here's the real important point, I think, for Rick, is does Rick suffer any psychological difficulties as a result of his immorality? Well, I mean, the answer to that one seems to be pretty clearly yes. Rick is obviously not happy, right? So from Plato's standpoint or Socrates' standpoint, they would tell Rick, look, you're a genius, but you're failing at life, right? You're failing at being a good person, and that's what's making you unhappy. What you really need to do is use your reason to rein in your alcoholism and your pursuit of, sensual indulgences, and to cultivate those virtues of temperance and exercise his reason in regard to those areas of his life. It's not like Rick is dumb, right? Rick is a scientific genius, but there seems to be a disconnect between his scientific genius, his mathematical and scientific and technological abilities, and his wisdom with regard to how to live a well-lived life, right? So pretty clearly there, Plato and Socrates would have some issues with Rick. They would think that, look, even if you have a portal gun, you should try to have courage. You should habituate courage, wisdom, and temperance and justice, and order your soul properly, and then you'll be happy. All right, so next up, in the next lecture, we'll look at Aristotle's virtue ethics. That's enough for Plato there. And Plato and Socrates. As always, if you have any questions about anything in this particular unit, be sure and send me an email with your question or post your question in the discussion forum to talk about with your classmates. Again, next up, we've got Aristotle. So until then, make sure you've caught up with the readings and work through the study aids, the reading questions and study questions, and thought about Plato's theory in regard to not only the movies that your book talks about, but in regard to Rick and Morty. All right, hope everybody's well. Y'all take care.